So today we'll be talking about Chapter 9, Section 1, and the title of this is The Market Revolution. We'll be talking about several technological changes. These changes brought about even greater interaction as well as more economic diversity among the regions of the nation. So we'll be talking about several different exciting inventions to start us off.
For the past 5 years, I've been investigating this question of where good ideas come from. It's the kind of problem I think all of us are intrinsically interested in. We want to be more creative, we want to come up with better ideas, we want our organizations to be more innovative. I've looked at this problem from an environmental perspective. What are the spaces that have historically led to unusual rates of creativity and innovation? And what I've found in all of these systems, there are these recurring patterns that you see again and again that are crucial to creating environments that are unusually innovative. One pattern I call the slow hunch, that breakthrough ideas almost never come in a moment of great insight, in a sudden stroke of inspiration. Most important ideas take a long time to evolve, and they spend a long time dormant in the background. It isn't until the idea has had 2 or 3 years, sometimes 10 or 20 years to mature, that it suddenly becomes accessible to you and useful to you in a certain way. And this is partially because good ideas normally come from the collision between smaller hunches, so that they form something bigger than themselves. So you see a lot in the history of innovation, cases of someone who has half of an idea. There's a great story about the invention of the World Wide Web in Tim Berners-Lee. This is a project that Berners-Lee worked on for 10 years. But when he started, he didn't have a full vision for this new medium he was going to invent. He started working on one project as a side project to help him organize his own data. He scrapped that after a couple years, and he started working on another thing. And only after about 10 years did the full vision of the World Wide Web come into being. That is, more often than not, how ideas happen. They need time to incubate, and they spend a lot of time in this partial hunch form. The other thing that's important when you think about ideas this way is that when ideas take form in this hunch state, they need to collide with other hunches. Oftentimes, the thing that turns a hunch into a real breakthrough is another hunch that's lurking in somebody else's mind. And you have to figure out a way to create systems that allow those hunches to come together and turn into something bigger than the sum of their parts. That's why, for instance, the coffee house in the Age of the Enlightenment or the Parisian salons of modernism were such engines of creativity because they created a space where ideas could mingle and swap and create new forms. When you look at the problem of innovation from this perspective, it sheds a lot of important light on the debate we've been having recently about what the internet is doing to our brains. Are we getting overwhelmed with an always connected, multitasking lifestyle? And is that going to lead to less sophisticated thoughts as we move away from the slower, deeper, contemplative state of reading, for instance? Obviously, I'm a big fan of reading, but I think it's important to remember that the great driver of scientific innovation and technological innovation has been the historic increase in connectivity, in our ability to reach out and exchange ideas with other people, and to borrow other people's hunches and combine them with our hunches and turn them into something new. That really has, I think, been, more than anything else, the primary engine of creativity and innovation over the last 600 or 700 years. And so yes, it's true we're more distracted. But what has happened that is really miraculous and marvelous over the last 15 years is that we have so many new ways to connect and so many new ways to reach out and find other people who have that missing piece that will complete the idea we're working on, or to stumble serendipitously across some amazing new piece of information that we can use to build and improve our own ideas. That's the real lesson of where good ideas come from, that chance favors the connected mind.
Okay, first off, in the early 1800s, farm families were largely self-sufficient. They could only buy what they couldn't make. Generally, families could make most everything they needed. They couldn't make wagon axles. They couldn't make some tools, but otherwise they could produce all the food they needed. They could make repairs to their home from trees that they cut down. They could make all of their meals from food that they had produced. If someone got sick, they might need to go see a doctor. But families typically had very little money, and so generally they tried to provide for their own. In the mid-1800s, farmers began specializing, meaning they would raise one or two crops for income instead of being subsistence farmers, which is what we call self-sufficient farming families. Subsistence means they would grow enough to survive and would typically not grow enough to earn an income. But by the mid-1800s, many farmers were able to clear large enough plots of land with several technological innovations that we'll be talking about today. They were able to farm enough property to grow enough, even with an individual family, to earn an income off of it. Now, with this income, farming families were able to afford to begin to purchase items that were made by others. And we call this a market revolution. Again, when we see that word, that means a profound change. And when I'm talking about farming families, I'm talking about most people in the country, because most people were still farmers at this time. And with these new inventions that we'll talk about today, they were significant enough that people were able to begin to buy things instead of just making enough to survive and living off of the land. So, several things that make this possible. Number one is an entrepreneurial spirit. That is the opportunity to get rich. Why did John Deere invent the steel plow? Why did Cyrus McCormick invent the mechanical reaper? Why did Samuel F.B. Morse invent the telegraph? Why did I.M. Singer invent the foot treadle for the sewing machine? Why did these people do these things? It wasn't out of the good of humanity. John Deere wasn't just thinking, I bet Jordan's ancestors are going to want to be able to farm lots of land. It wasn't out of a spirit of goodwill. John Deere became immensely wealthy. In fact, that one invention set him for life, so he would never have to work again. Cyrus McCormick, the same. He invented a device that allowed one farmer to do the work of several farmers with a machine. Why did he do it? Again, it wasn't out of goodwill. It was so that he could get rich. That's what we call an entrepreneurial spirit, and that is the essence of capitalism. That, why are you here? You're here to get a good education so that you can get a good job. So that you can become a better person, sure. But it's self-motivation that makes you strive for betterment. That's capitalism. That you, motivated by your own self-interest, are going to do great things. But that also helps everyone. Because maybe you're going to be an excellent doctor. Maybe you're going to be a great lawyer. Maybe you're going to be a professional of some kind or a business person. And whatever it is you do, the fact that you're going to be great at it is going to be good for everyone. You're out to help yourself. But ultimately that helps us all, because Carly's going to go out and be rich and famous, and she's going to pay lots of taxes. And those taxes will provide for the roads that you drive on, for the medical care that you receive, for the education that your children will someday receive, for all the public goods and services will be paid for through the taxes that Carly is going to pay by someday being rich and famous. Now, if she weren't rich and famous, she would still pay taxes, but she'll pay more taxes if she goes on to be rich and famous. Again, providing for more goods that benefit the whole community. So, capital is another word for money. But it's not just money. Capital means the money the property, the machines, the tools necessary to generate income. So what do we need within a business to generate income? Well, first off, we need a location. Even if your business is online, you still have to have a location which to conduct your business. That would be property. Secondly, we have to have income. Even if your business is online, you still have to generate an income so that you can pay your bills. And then finally, machines, the tools with which to do your business. We call those things capital, generally in an economic term, and capital fuels a growing economy. An entrepreneur is someone who uses their own capital to generate profit. If Michaela has a business idea, maybe it's something in web design, maybe it fills a niche within her interest. So let's say that she has an interest in anime, and she just loves anime. And she can draw it, she can manipulate it, and that's her thing. Well, she could turn that into a business. Maybe she creates a website design company that can develop anime-themed templates for websites. And she can begin to draw these templates using graphic design, and she can contract these out for companies. She could start doing that now. She could generate income now. Doesn't have to wait till she gets a degree. By the time she finishes school, she could be earning a sizable income off of her side business. She would be an entrepreneur. Because to start, she would have to use her own resources, her time, her money, her energy. She would yield off of the product of her work, her time, her labor, her resources, her energy. Off of the product of her labor, she would yield profit. She's not going to do it for any of your sakes. She's going to do it for her own. But she will have to pay taxes on that income. And those taxes will benefit all of us. Now again, an entrepreneur, which by the way is a French word, it means to undertake, is someone who undertakes an endeavor for their own profit. Any of you can be an entrepreneur. Most businesses will require some investment capital, meaning that in most cases you will have to go to a bank to get a loan, because many businesses will require a location to operate within. And most businesses cannot be operated out of your home, yet some can. The web design business, sure. Any type of online commerce, sure. But if you need a physical location, perhaps you will need capital. And that benefits a whole lot of different people. Because you will go to the bank, they will issue a loan, they will receive a profit, they will take those profits and put them into further investments, i.e. more home loans, more business loans. And so an entrepreneurial spirit does benefit the whole community. That's the essence of capitalism. Now, a number of new inventions spurred by entrepreneurs developed a lot of new profits. Profits for the inventors and new products for the consumer. For example, Charles Goodyear did not invent rubber, yet he invented a process called vulcanization that could make rubber useful. Rubber literally grows on trees. It's a form of sap that is a malleable substance when it dries. But yet, if you take that same substance and you take it through the process of vulcanization, well, then it's the rubber on our shoes. It's the rubber on your tires. It won't melt in heat because sap will turn back to sap. if it's hot enough. Rubber won't melt until it reaches a burning temperature. Unvulcanized rubber will also freeze and become brittle. Your shoes will be fine unless it reaches a very severe temperature in which you're not likely to see. Your tires will be fine unless it reaches Arctic level temperatures, in which case rubber's not going to be great out there. Another inventor, and again, these people became very wealthy doing what they did. Elias Howe patented the sewing machine, providing for the domestic mechanization of textile production. It's a fancy way of saying now people can make clothes at home much faster than the old hand sewing treadle. And I.M. Singer developed the foot treadle. You see, the sewing machine was invented long before electricity was available for home consumption. And so the sewing machine was a hand-cranked device. I.M. Singer perfected that device with the foot treadle, because instead of it taking two people to operate, one to crank by hand, one to operate the machine, now one person can pedal and make clothing at the same time. Of course, these two people became rich. In fact, if you buy sewing materials today, you will see one of their two names on those products still today. Yeah. This made the factory production of clothing possible. This made home production of clothing possible. In fact, this benefited everyone because the price of clothing dropped so significantly that clothing became affordable for the average person. And so we're talking about a market revolution here, where people stopped making clothing by hand and started buying it in stores because it was now practical to do so. This has a great impact on the household economy. For example, farmers began using mechanized farm equipment to boost industrial output. For example, the mechanical reaper that I'll show you in just a moment is a form of mechanization. Why use a mule when a mule can get old? A mule has to be fed. A mule can get tired and only work a certain amount. Oxen can be difficult to work with. Horses are better, but they require a lot of overhead and care. A machine merely needs to be cleaned and taken care of. And yeah, fuel will come later when we get to like combustible engines and so forth. But at this time, a machine only needs to be cleaned and fixed if it breaks. It doesn't complain. It doesn't get hungry. But a machine can outwork a human or an animal. These mechanical reapers increased a farmer's output 8-fold. This is good for the farmer. This means that a farmer can operate a larger tract of land with less labor. As a business owner, a farmer can produce more capital with less expense thanks to mechanization. From the consumer end, a farmer can produce more with less. They can translate that to savings for the consumer thanks to greater volume. So in the end, mechanization helps us all. Helps the farmer make more money. It helps us save money. So here's a photograph of one of the earliest sewing machines developed by Elias Howe. So the machine here, developed by Elias Howe, but you see down here the foot treadle, which powers the machine, allows this one individual to create clothing far quicker than they could by hand. The next invention I'd like to show you the telegraph. In 1837, Samuel F.B. Morse developed the very first electronic communication. Every time you send a text message, it is part and parcel thanks to Samuel F.B. Morse. The electromagnetic telegraph allowed messages to be tapped in code, carried by copper wire, to be transmitted across long distances. Because what Samuel Morse was able to harness was electrical current. Electrical current, as we know, travels through conductors. Copper is an excellent conductor of electromagnetic current. And that current creates a signal, a very faint signal, a noise that you can hear. If you stand under a transformer, you hear a buzzing. And that buzzing is a large amount of current passing through a conductor. But you can create the same sound if you amplify it through a small amount of current. And if you stop that current in a pattern, you can communicate. He developed a code, named it after himself, Morse code. And with that code, a series of taps, both fast and small, you can interrupt the code in a pattern and you can communicate. I'm sure you all know what this one means. Anybody? Any Boy Scouts, Girl Scouts in the room? SOS, very good. SOS is the international symbol for help. If for some reason you cannot get a message out or you cannot communicate, this very simple device can get a message out over long distances. If you're stranded on the beach, put SOS, and anyone will recognize that in any language. If you can develop a method of communicating, did I do it backwards?
Yes.
Dot, 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 dash, dash. Okay. Yeah, I couldn't remember. So yeah, it's... And again, this technique can be communicated in so many different ways. It's a series of sounds. You know, for example, if we needed to communicate with the neighboring classrooms, so if we needed to get to a message to the computer lab, see if somebody comes in. That's SOS. Now, I did that with a series of sounds. What makes Samuel F.B. Morse famous and what made him rich was he was able to do that across long distances through electrical current, because his device that you see here interrupts the electrical current. Every time he presses down the handle, it stops the current. If he presses it down and quickly releases it, that's a dot. If he presses it down and holds it for a second, then releases, that's a dash. With that simple binary system, he was able to develop a code called Morse code and communicate. Does anybody know what the very first message sent electronically was? Yes?
I don't remember it.
That's okay.
I thought you meant from ships.
No, the very first message that Samuel F.B. Morse sent. It's okay if you don't know. Well, he knew he was going to be famous. He knew he had had a breakthrough, that he was going to be rich, that this was going to change the world. So he thought of something really profound to say. And the first message he sent electronically is, "What God hath wrought." He was thinking of Pandora's box, that he had just opened this big, that he had just changed the world. And in many ways, he did. In fact, his device was patented in 1837. By 1854, there were 23,000 miles of telegraph cable that had crossed the entire country. In fact, by the end of the 1800s, there will be a telegraph cable under the Atlantic Ocean connecting the two continents. And the telegraph is going to change history in a big way. But next, let's talk about transportation. The steam engine, which I've got a video here of the steam engine to show you. The steam engine had a profound impact on transportation. Because you see, heat can be harnessed. Electric current represents energy. Heat is a form of energy. The greater the heat, the more energy you have. But the question is how to harness this to create combustion. And the inventor of the steam engine, not an American by the way, but we'll talk about how Americans use this to create some innovations of our own. But the inventor of the steam engine was able to harness the power of heat by using heat to create pressure. By heating up water, water turns to vapor. That steam, under pressure, creates energy. And if that energy is harnessed, it can create combustion. So if you allow that steam to escape pressure and then place a mechanical device to spin as the steam escapes, that creates combustion. And you can propel a craft that way. Now, Robert Fulton, a wealthy business person, purchased one of these steam engines, had it installed on a boat, and his steamboat was able to go up the Hudson River. Up the Hudson River. It wasn't fast. In fact, it took 32 hours to go 150 miles. But he was able to go up the Hudson River. Previously, this had been made possible by people paddling and going up a river, even as slow as the Hudson River, by paddle or by sail, would be difficult at best, if not impossible. But this man proved that it could be done in a predictable time, consistently, using the steam engine. By 1830, steamboats on western rivers were commonplace. They cut down the cost of shipping. They sped up the cost of transport of cargo and people. And water transport became key for moving heavy materials and raw materials, heavy machines. The Erie Canal, which connected the Great Lakes to the Atlantic Ocean, was heavily used. And it allowed lowering of cost, the construction of more canals. Effectively, what the steam engine did was allow the transport of freight upriver, where previously goods could only be shipped downriver. I mean, it's huge. And canals also connected Midwestern farms to northeastern markets. And so really what we're talking about here, folks, is a greater means of transportation and a greater means of development for economic prosperity.
The rising prosperity that accompanied industrialization also brought improvements in transportation. First, the roads, that in the past were often little better than crude muddy tracks, were improved to handle more traffic. And new bridges were constructed, some made entirely of wood for the very first time. As early as 1761, an intricate system of canals and locks began to be constructed, so that barges could carry fuel and raw materials from mines, factories, finished goods from factories to city warehouses. As early as 1825, steam engines were being used to turn the wheels of locomotives, moved along steel tracks at the unheard-of speed of 15 miles per hour. Also by that time, steam-powered ships were beginning to travel the seas, no longer dependent on the ever-changing winds. And in the 19th century, huge parts of North America and Europe completed their transition to an industrial society. Steam-powered farm machines, from tractors to hay balers, revolutionized farming. And by the start of the 20th century, the United States had overtaken England to become the world's leading industrialized nation.
Now, railroads operated using the steam engine. But unlike the simple contraption that we just witnessed, trains required much more combustion, equivalent to that of what the steamships used. And while trains moved slowly at this time compared to trains or cars today, we're talking 15 miles an hour. And while shipping by railroad was much more expensive than shipping by boat, it was faster. Also, railroads could operate in winter, and they could go overland. Previously, the transportation of freight could only be accomplished by river, and generally goods had to be shipped downriver. And so farmers and settlers were limited to movement along big rivers. But now, goods can be shipped over land, and they can be shipped year-round. It's huge. Now, train travel at this time was rather uncomfortable. Shocks weren't very good, so passenger travel by train, certainly uncomfortable. But it was possible. It was possible for people to move overland now instead of having to walk, instead of having to take a wagon, which could take months at a time. They could take a train, which can travel consistently and predictably over long tracts of land. And again, it cuts down the cost of travel. It cuts down the time of travel. It also cuts down the cost and time of freight, which helps the economy.
Once steam trains were proven to be an efficient way to move people and freight, businessmen began to build tracks for them to run. George Stephenson built the world's first public railroad in 1825. The Stockton and Darlington ran for about 20 miles and 32 kilometers, and was the first to carry freight on a regular schedule. Stephenson also built the first passenger railroad in England. It opened in 1830 and ran between the towns of Liverpool and Manchester. In America, it was the barge and canal companies that had the money and the knowledge to build the first railroad. The Delaware and Hudson Canal Company purchased an English-built steam locomotive, the Sturbridge Line, in 1829. It was the first full-size locomotive to operate in North America. A year later, the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad was first in America to carry passengers. In the beginning, the B&O's trains were drawn by horses, like their canal barges, but they experimented with a rail car powered by a sickle. That experiment failed, and in 1831 they began carrying passengers behind a steam locomotive called the York. By 1835, over 1,000 miles, that's 1,600 kilometers of track had been laid. More than 200 separate railroads connected towns and cities in 11 eastern states. By the end of the 19th century, thousands of trains made their way across the largest transportation network the world had ever known. Railroads were the biggest business in America, and because they made moving between cities and factories and farms so easy, they also made nearly all other businesses possible.
Okay, so the effect these inventions had. Number one, they improved transportation. With trains, with steamboats, you could now travel much more quickly and much more easily. Devices like the telegraph improved communication. Now people can communicate instantly through telegraphic messages, whereas previously you would have to communicate only by letter, which could take weeks or months to travel between. And what this did to us as a country was it connected regions of our country. Henry Clay envisioned a society where we would be so connected, both economically and personally, that we would have no need to go to war with one another. And his hope with the American system was that by connecting our regions economically, personally, and politically, that we could be a united States instead of a divided one. But technology made this possible in a way that Henry Clay could have only dreamed of. In fact, today, technology is globalizing our world, connecting countries that had once been enemies and making them now business partners. And in many ways, that's what the telegraph and the steamboat did for our country. For example, by 1838, the very first national highway, called the National Road, extended from Maryland all the way to Illinois. And these growing links connect different parts of our country. The South, however, did not develop the degree of infrastructure that the North did. There were far fewer railroads, far fewer canals, far less technology in the South, because most people who were investing in the North in technology were making money that way. But in the South, so much money could be made off of cotton, there was no need to invest in technology. You could invest and receive a greater yield on your investment in the South on agriculture than you could in technology. More money to be made on cotton in the South than there was on technology. And so the South lacked the capital to invest in factories, because anyone who did have capital was investing in agriculture because more money there. Most of the money was tied up in land, in slaves, relying on cotton, tobacco, and... But the Northeast, as a result of this technology, became a center for American commerce. For example, New York City became the central link between U.S. farms and European markets. And so the great rise in manufacturing was centered around the northeastern United States. Our factories could produce more, better, and less expensive goods. The factory system allowed us to produce in great volume, and that translated into lower cost for the consumer. Innovations in regards to farming. John Deere made an improvement on a device that had been in use for thousands of years. Folks, if you want to never work again, you make an improvement on a device that had been in use for a very long time. If you can change the world, you will never have to work again. That's what John Deere did. Again, motivated by profit, sure. But when he introduced the steel plow, previously plows had been made of iron. Iron is a soft and malleable metal. It loses its edge easily. Steel is a much harder substance. A steel plow can cut through rocky soil. So effectively what he did was allowed farmers to grow crops in places they previously could not grow crops.
Iron hits like a really hard rock, it can break, but...
With this, farmers could replace oxen with horses. Horses who can plow much faster and are more reliable and don't have to pull as hard as oxen, because steel can hold a sharper edge for a longer time. Another one of these big innovations, Cyrus McCormick invents the mechanical reaper. As I said previously, one farmer could do the work of 5 farmers. Ladies and gentlemen, that is a huge innovation. Because if one farmer no longer has to hire 4 people to help him, that's 4 people's income that farmer gets to put in the pocket and keep. That's more money for the farmer. That translates to cheaper crops, better for consumers, better for the economy in general. And these 2 devices allow farmers to shift from subsistence farming to cash crops. Because think about this, before the mechanical reaper, farmers used a scythe. This is a scythe. This is a hand reaper, a tool farmers would use to bring in the sheaves, to bring in grain. It's back-breaking work. They would do this all day long, cutting grain by hand, all day long. Back-breaking work, and it's a slow process. The mechanical reaper does that automatically. So here's a drawing of one of these mechanical reapers. Instead of the scythe, you can now do it automatically. And that's in the 1830s. That's a big deal. And so here we see a drawing of the mechanical reaper in use on this farm. Farmer's still located near rivers because the steamboat provided excellent shipping for freight. But this man can now sit as horses pull this reaper, which harvests his crops automatically. Okay, now I think that's it for our section. Yeah. So today we'll be talking about Chapter 9, Section 2. And the title of this is Manifest Destiny. As we talk about Americans moving west, we'll be talking about some of the motives that American people use to justify their expansion, as well as some of the routes that we used to expand into the western part of the United States. But eventually we're going to be talking about the expansion all the way to the coast from the East Coast. Eventually we would be a nation from sea to shining sea. But where did this term manifest destiny come from? And that's where I'd like... The term itself was coined by a writer named John O'Sullivan, and he was a writer for the Democratic Party. He wrote, and I quote, "Our manifest destiny is to overspread the continent, allotted by Providence, for the free development of our yearly multiplying millions." From the beginning, we believed that it was our right, our God-given right, to expand westward. No matter what we had to do, no matter who we had to kill, no matter what we had to steal, take, or borrow, that it was given to us. At least that's how we like to justify it. I'd like to show you one of our oldest hymns. This is our national hymn. You've all heard of the national anthem. This is our national hymn. And I'd like to read the first part. I'm not going to try to sing it. I'm going to read it for you. My country, 'tis of thee, sweet land of liberty, of thee I sing. Land where my fathers died, land of the pilgrim's pride, from every mountain's side, let freedom ring. And if you go on and read the rest, this is the song that discusses the idea of manifest destiny. Talking about the land that we live on and praying for God's blessing over this land that we would eventually take from every mountainside. Well, a little of our early history. Prior to 1840, very few Americans had been moving west. Most chose to stay east of the Appalachians. In fact, very few Americans had even gone to the Louisiana Territory itself. Louisiana Territory spanned from the western part of the Appalachians all the way west, even west of the Mississippi. Now, most of that land was still unsettled. Most of it was inhabited by natives, or even much of it was undeveloped entirely. Yet after 1840, many more people began to move west. And many people were motivated by this idea that this land belonged to them, and that we were destined to eventually incorporate all of the land from the Atlantic Ocean to the Pacific. And that idea is called manifest destiny. Attitudes about the frontier. The Panic of 1837 proved to be a great push factor in migration. That means that it motivated people to get the heck out of there. Moving west offered someone who was broke or owed a lot of money or was in trouble previously to start over. And the Panic of 1837 led a lot of people to be broke, in debt, or in trouble. And so many wanted to start over. And going west was the perfect opportunity for that. The Oregon Territory even opened up trade with Asian countries and even began construction of a Pacific. But as we talk about the western United States, our image of the West has been shaped by a lot of popular culture. If you've ever seen the show Little House on the Prairie, it's a famous TV show from the 1980s following the story of a young girl who wrote her life experiences. Her name was Laura Ingalls Wilder, and her journals and her memoirs became the television show that was Little House on the Prairie. But here's an actual photograph of a farm in a western territory. Number one, you can see it's very dry. You can see it's very flat. And you can see it's sparsely populated. In fact, not much has changed from this photograph. As you drive west, you will see it's still flat, it's still dry, and it's still sparsely populated, and mostly farmland.
Before about 1840, few American citizens had ever seen the far west. Apart from a few trappers, a handful of traders, and a small number of immigrants who had migrated to Oregon, California, and Texas, almost no one had ever been west of the settlements bordering the Mississippi River. But if you did go west and wrote about what they saw, they described the unsurpassed beauty of the land. They told of wide open spaces under endless skies. Easterners came to see the West as a kind of promised land, brimming with opportunity and free for taking. Oddly, the right of Americans to occupy that land was scarcely questioned, even though, of course, it was already occupied. Numerous tribes of Native Americans had lived in the western and eastern regions since prehistoric times, but whatever rights these first Americans might have had by reason of first occupation were largely ignored. Still, the systematic suppression of Indian rights did require a rationale, a principle on which to build public policy. That principle was to be found in the concept of manifest destiny. It was the belief that Americans, with their democratic institutions, their religion, and their industrial civilization, had an obvious God-given right, almost an obligation, to spread their culture over the continent.
Now, contact between settlers and Native Americans dates back to the earliest colonial settlements. In fact, when Columbus landed on the very first islands in what he termed the West Indies. He came in contact with a group of natives that he called the Taino. And so as European settlers became American citizens, and as American citizens began to expand, everywhere we expanded, we found native peoples. Now, generally, these Native Americans would choose to maintain their own cultural institutions and their own ways of life, just as we choose to hold on to our own aspects of our own culture and our own ways of life. Some do assimilate, like the Cherokee. Some do fight, like the Seminoles that we've talked about, or the Apache and Sioux that we'll be talking about soon. And some, in fact, go to war. In the 1830s, settlers in the Illinois Territory, as well as the Iowa territories, pressured natives in those areas to move west, to get out of these places and to let the settlers have their land. The Black Hawk tribe led a rebellion in the Illinois and Wisconsin territories. Just like Little Turtle, just like Tecumseh, these people formed a confederacy of Native American tribes to attempt to fight the Americans and keep their land. These tribes were defeated. The Sow and the Fox were forcibly moved west by the Mississippi. And these natives were forced to leave their homes and to find new places to live. And so the Black Hawk War was a great defeat for the Native Americans.
With removal now an official policy of the United States government, the journey of thousands of Native Americans east to west continued throughout the 1830s. Not everyone left peacefully. Disappointed with his tribe's removal to Iowa, Sauk Chief Black Hawk recrossed the Mississippi in 1832, hopeful he could reclaim his people's homeland. What followed was called the Black Hawk War. It was more chase than war, as troops chased Black Hawk and his people up through Illinois, through Wisconsin, down the Wisconsin River to the Mississippi. Black Hawk left the group to find allies to join his fight. At the mouth of the Bad Axe River, Black Hawk's people, many elders, women, and children, were massacred trying to surrender.
Now, if you read a lot of Western literature, there's often discussion about middle ground. It's another word for land that no one really wanted to live in. It was a neutral zone, if you will, a buffer between native villages and Western American settlements. And so it's an area not dominated by either particular group. It's where often these two parties would meet. And I'm not talking about a specific area. I just mean that there were many forts and settlements that Americans were establishing in these western provinces as we were moving in that direction. And then there would be unclaimed land between native villages and these forts or settlements, where often people would meet to trade. And so sometimes we forget when we think about westward migration as a long-standing war that ended officially in 1890. But in fact, it was just a movement of peoples. And like any other movement of peoples, there is sometimes conflict, but there is more often trade and communication. And people go on about their daily lives. For example, the sack of Troy, if you've ever seen that movie with Brad Pitt and Eric Banner, not Eric Banner, but whoever played the Hulk in that old movie. It was a neat movie. But that's all it is. It's based on an amazing poem by an ancient writer named Homer about the sack of this great city in antiquity. Archaeologists have dug up the city of Troy, and they found that it was actually burned down about 7 different times. And they found that the invasion of Troy from the Greeks lasted over 7 years. And that in reality, all that happened was these Greek people set up a settlement near the settlement of Troy. And then from there, they traded, they intermarried, they conducted business and lived their lives and would occasionally fight one another. And that's often what we see here in these westward settlements. The middle ground did often move further west, especially as a result of the Indian Removal Act of 1830. But again, when you look at the West and when you drive out there, that's often what you see until you get to the Rocky Mountains. Now, as I said, while natives were being pushed westward, some did fight. In 1851, a treaty was brokered between the United States and representatives of Native American tribes. It was called the Treaty of Fort Laramie. The United States promised to officially honor Native American tribal boundaries. Native Americans would gain control of the Central Plains, think Kansas, Iowa, the Dakotas. In return, Native tribes that signed this treaty promised not to attack American settlers. The agreement was that American settlers must respect the boundaries established within this treaty. Inside those boundaries would be the sovereign nations of these Native American tribes. They would be considered as different countries. In return, as long as these boundaries were respected, settlers were not to be attacked. And while the American government never intended to fully honor this treaty in the long term, it was seen as a compromise. But it didn't stop large numbers of settlers from continuing to move into the West. It didn't stop settlers from hunting buffalo, not only for food and skins, but even for sport or just to kill. And so the buffalo population became depleted. And that's going to be significant when we talk about especially the Sioux, who depended on the buffalo for their very way of life. Americans would constantly violate this treaty as we moved west. In fact, Custer's famous last stand was over a border dispute because General Armstrong Custer was sent to defend the Sioux borders in the Dakotas. But gold was discovered on Sioux lands. And so instead of defending the borders like he was ordered to do, he was selling mining rights to settlers, offering them protection like he was some kind of gang lord. And he got himself and his men killed for that. But again, the official treaty was meant to be a peace agreement promising mutual compromise. But unfortunately, it didn't work out that way. And now we're going to begin talking about some of the migration routes that Americans followed as they moved west. First is the Trail to Santa Fe. Santa Fe, New Mexico, was a popular trading hub between the United States and Mexico. Santa Fe was within the sovereign Mexican territory at this time. New Mexico, Texas, Arizona, California had not yet been conquered by Mexico. So again, traders traveling down to Santa Fe were doing so to trade for goods with Mexico and then return with their cargo. Traders would travel in groups. This was an ancient form of long-distance overland travel. They would travel in caravans for protection. Sometimes they would go alone for the first bit, but then again, when they were crossing this vast expanse of undeveloped territory, they would band together into caravans. Once there, people would trade for silver, for gold, for furs. It was, again, a commerce route. And it was a busy one relative to the time. And so most people, again, weren't moving down there to permanently settle. They were moving down to trade in this popular hub. And that actually helped Santa Fe grow into a thriving commercial center of trade between these two peoples. Now, the other routes that we'll be talking about, such as the Mormon migration or the Oregon Trail, were meant to settle permanently. Most people traveling on those routes were going to live in these areas. But in this case, it's very much a route designed for commerce. Typically, people would start off in the town of Independence, Missouri. And this town grew in prominence and importance because of its launching off point. There were outfitters there where you could buy supplies. You could buy tools for your wagon. You could buy food and water and clothing and necessary rations to get yourself across the long distance of the Great Plains. Because even today, if you set off for Santa Fe or you set off for the Oregon, well, today the state of Oregon, or you set off for Utah, you will be driving across the Great Plains. I drove it last summer by myself. It is a long way to go by yourself. It was an overnight trip. I found a place to sleep in my car and I stayed the night. I made sure to fill up my gas tank when it got to a quarter. I never let it go below a quarter because I knew there would often be 50 miles or more between exits. At one point, my oil started leaking. I was concerned I wasn't going to make it. I got to my destination, Buena Vista, Colorado, with about a quart of oil left in my tank, checking it every few miles to make sure I was okay, trying to coast when possible because we're talking about a long 2-day drive through not much. And if it's still not much today, it certainly wasn't much back then. And so people had a long and sometimes dangerous trek over land. Can you imagine making that journey in this vehicle? I mean, it was sketchy enough in my Subaru since it had the oil leak, and I was a little concerned about that. I can't imagine making that journey. This is called a Conestoga wagon. This was the luxury class model at that time. The axle was static, meaning no shocks. You felt every bump. The roof was made of canvas, so it could be removed in times of nice weather. But since it was a static axle with no shocks, and since these wheels are made of wood, it often broke down. It's going to be fine on flat, even ground. But good luck finding flat, even ground. Another thing out west, you're going to want to bring a vehicle that either has four-wheel drive or all-wheel drive. Because if you're following your GPS, you will wind up traveling off-road, even using a GPS, which they didn't even have roads often enough, or they were following beaten paths.
By 1820, the Spanish missions in California had grown to prosperous ranches, produced such commodities as olives, wine, and cowhides. But commercial trade with the United States had long been discouraged by the Spanish government. Even New Mexico, which could be reached overland from the American frontier, was not allowed to trade with the Americans. But in 1821, the Mexicans were able to win their independence from Spain. New Mexico and California became provinces of the Republic of Mexico. The Mexican government opened the door to trade. The result was the birth of an overland trade route, the famed Santa Fe Trail, which ran from Franklin, Missouri, and later from Westport Landing, 900 miles over barren grassland to Santa Fe. The trail was simply a wagon track, sometimes deeply rutted, but in other places just a broad corridor through the grass. Over the trail bound for Mexico passed manufactured goods such as cotton cloth, while traders might return to Missouri with mules and Mexican silver.
So the next trail I want to talk about is the trail to Oregon. In 1836, settlers began going to the Oregon Territory. First off, this proved that wagons could make the journey, that there was a pass through the Rockies that could get you to Oregon and to the Northwest. There are some passes through the Rockies. You can go south, around through Texas, but what the Oregon Trail proved was that there was a Northwest passage, but that it can be fraught with peril. For example, if you go west of Denver, you're going to go over the pass that will take you west of the Rockies. That road will take you up to 11,000 feet elevation. Stands to reason that road is only passable for a few months out of the year. And that's a major 6-lane interstate with tunnels. That's only passable for a few months out of the year. And so again, these settlers had to be very careful on the passage to the Oregon Territory so that they did not cross at the wrong time. They would time the launch of their journey from Independence, Missouri, so that they arrived through the Northwest Passage at just the right time. People were journeying there to settle. The Oregon Trail might have been the most dangerous and difficult migration route of them all, because settlers would cross through hostile territories. They would cross through extremely high elevations. The base elevation of Denver itself, one of the flatter parts of Colorado, is at 6,000 feet. But then you've got the Rocky Mountains right there, just outside the city. And those mountains go up to 14,000 feet in many cases. And the passes through them, again, are often covered in snow. These pioneers were taking those wagons through those passes. Those wagons that you just saw sometimes took teams of up to 6 horses. You've got a lot of variables there. What if one of those horses dies? They probably will. What if one breaks a leg? You got to kill it. How are you going to eat? How are you going to get water? I mean, in all reality, if you're crossing through those lands, there are very specific places that you've got to get, because water is scarce, food is scarce. If you lose a horse or two, that could mean your life. I'm sure you've heard the story of the Donner Party. They tried to make the Northwest Passage and got caught by winter. They poorly timed their trip. They got delayed trying to find a shortcut. They got caught in the mountains, and almost all of them starved to death. Of course, before the end, they turned to cannibalism. 1 or 2 managed to escape and find a settlement and get help. And when they returned with a rescue party, they found the survivors eating the dead. And so the Oregon Trail, I wanted to show you on a map here real quick, requires a great degree of courage. The westernmost settlement was Fort Boise, and that's in Idaho. It's now the capital city of Idaho. At this point, settlers have made it west of the Rockies. In fact, if you're driving by car, this is about a 12-hour drive from Denver. You've got to go over the Rockies to get to Boise. I plan on going there next summer, actually. And settlers would then travel all the way. Now here, we're talking about roughly a 1-month voyage just from Boise to the next westernmost settlement, which was called the Whitman Mission.
1818, Britain and the United States jointly claimed the land known as Oregon Territory. But because of their fur traders, Britain had much more influence in the territory.
And in fact, of course, Hudson's Bay Company, even though they had a lot of men in their forts, are not engaged in settlement of families and development of culture that would be rivaling or in contest with native cultures in the 1820s and 30s.
It changed when white settlers started crossing the Rocky Mountains in covered wagons. Oregon Trail would bring more than 350,000 settlers to the Pacific Northwest by the Civil War. The British left for Canada. News of cheap and sometimes free land and a better way of life spread quickly in the East.
Societies back in Boston, for instance, that would, for the settlement of Oregon, and they would tell how that not only was this a land overflowing with flowing with milk and honey, it was overflowing with milk and honey, and of course there's just nothing at all to get across the plains and get here, you know.
The Oregon Trail became known as the longest graveyard in the world. It estimated that 10 people died for every mile of trail, 1 out of 15. But despite the hardships, Americans pushed west. Settlers had taken all the land east of the Great Plains, and the perception was that the only good land left was in Oregon country and California. The plains were thought to be useless, and after the Removal Act, home of displaced Native Americans. But that too would change with Transcontinental Railroad.
So the last migration route I want to talk about is the Mormon migration. The Mormon religion was started by a man named Joseph Smith, who lived in the territory of Illinois. He claimed to have received visions from heaven, upon which angels brought golden tablets revealing a New Testament that should be added to the Bible. And this New Testament he wrote down would be called the Book of Mormon, detailing an ancient story of Jesus' appearance to a group of Native American peoples. And so after the crucifixion and the ascension, the legend is, according to the Book of Mormon, that he came down and visited the native peoples here in the Americas and preached a new gospel to them. And that would be called the Book of Mormon. It was rather controversial for a number of reasons, not limited to the religious connotations of a New Testament. But perhaps the most controversial aspect of this religion was their practice of polygamy, that men were encouraged to take many wives, and this was actually part of their religion. The practice of polygamy earned the Mormons a great deal of ridicule, and Illinois newspapers began to print nasty things about Joseph Smith and his followers. Well, Joseph Smith was very passionate about his beliefs and very upset about the things the newspapers were saying about him and his people. And so he blew up the newspaper publishers. This is considered an act of terrorism. And so he was arrested. People hated Joseph Smith and the Mormons so much, they stormed into the prison, they yanked him out of the jail, and they hung him in front of the town. Now, Brigham Young was Joseph Smith's second in command. He was his successor. And so Brigham Young led all of the Mormon people out of the Illinois territory. They were going to move west. They were going to find a better place to live where they could be safe from religious persecution. The goal was to escape the United States. And they wound up settling in a place called the Great Salt Lake in Utah. And while there, the American military sent several different companies of soldiers to hinder their efforts and to stop them. They were seen as seditious, as expatriates, as rebels. And the Mormon people actually fought off a few different military detachments sent against them. Eventually, the Mormons settled in Great Salt Lake City in Utah, and that has now become the capital of Utah. And when they applied for statehood, the American government hated the Mormons so much that they refused to allow Utah to become a state until Brigham Young died. It was written into the charter that Utah could become a state when Brigham Young died. Now, if anything tells us about America's expansionist attitude, perhaps it's James K. Polk's election. When Polk ran for president, he promised, and his slogan was 54-40 or fight, that we would annex the territory of Oregon from Great Britain, or we would go to war with Great Britain. That was the campaign slogan in 1846, and that's what won Polk the presidency. Can you imagine?
In 1846, Brigham Young led a group of Mormon people west and past the Rockies. The Mormons were a group of pioneers who were in search of religious freedom. In July of 1847, the Mormons reached the Great Salt Lake Valley in what is now Utah. Young chose to settle this land because he thought no other settlers would want it. The land was hot and dry, and the lake was saltier than the ocean. But the Mormons built irrigation canals. Those canals brought water from the mountains to irrigate their farms. They made that desert land grow crops of grain, fruits, and vegetables. This settlement would come to be called Salt Lake City.
I've been there.
We had a little bit of money with a farm in Illinois that never made us nothing, so we got the girls and boys and we gathered up our stuff on a cold March night. We piled in the wagons to give us a better life. Everyone was daydreaming, what's it like in Oregon? Moving real steady, the wheels rolling along. A fire hit the wagon and we lost an extra axle and a couple pounds of food. I didn't know what to do. I had to keep going through the ice and the snow. We were sliding everywhere and my ox broke a bone. Somehow we managed to make it to the Kansas River crossing. Didn't stop to look around and see we had a little problem. Didn't have the extra money for a guide, so we cocked the wagon and got everyone inside. We pushed off the banks, everything was going fine till the wagon tipped over and Agent B died. And I didn't know how to deal with the pain. You can't write an epitaph on watery graves, and it made me insane. We traveled at a grueling pace, held back the food, they'd be too weak to complain. And I started tripping out, the mountains was turning colors. I kept on going, didn't care about the others. We ran out of food and I tried to maintain, but I hallucinated and got lost for 4 days. I had to make a choice as the trail divides. We headed to Green River, but would we survive? Dysentery got Tommy and Sarah was exhausted. I was like the army man, we had to keep marching. Sarah kept coughing, I wasn't stopping. Then Sarah died, it was the nail in my coffin. Tommy kept crying and I kept on my way till we got to Green River. Tommy begged me not to make the very same mistake that killed Agent B, but I wouldn't let this river get the best of me. So I cocked it again until I heard that old sound of a wagon tipping over and little Tommy drowned. And then I lost Billy and I lost my mind. In the middle of the wilderness, your wagon leader died and somebody wrote an epitaph, here lies King. I tried to get the trail, but the trail got me.
Now, today we'll be talking about Chapter 9, Section 3. And the title of this is Expansion into Texas. As we talk about America's expansion, which really this section is all about manifest destiny and American growth, much of the land had already been claimed. Of course, we talked a couple of days ago about how we interacted with the Native Americans when we came upon land that had already been claimed by them. Generally, we went to war with them, or we made treaties where the Native Americans ceded or gave their land as they were forced to evacuate and move to other places so that we could settle these territories. Now, if we're willing to fight and kill for more territory, what do we do when a European nation has already claimed territory? Now, of course, formally Spain owned much of what is today the United States. They laid claim to the Louisiana Territory. They laid claim to Florida. They laid claim to the entire southwestern United States. But eventually, Mexico would declare its independence from Spain, which we'll get to in just a moment. And now, as the United States is moving forward in the mid-1800s, what are we going to do when another nation already claims this territory that we desire? So expansion, coming into conflict with Mexico, is going to be the theme of the next 2 days, but also the political issues of slavery and the expansion of slavery. In fact, the expansion into Texas is going to be one of these divisive issues that's going to lead us into the American Civil War. Now, as we begin talking about American settlement in the Southwest, let's go back a little bit. While the Spanish were colonizing the Western Hemisphere, remember that it began with the West Indies. The conquest of Mexico from the Aztecs dates back to Cortez in the mid-1600s. And once the Aztecs were conquered, Mexico became a colony of Spain. The northern part of Mexico was sparsely populated. It's a very dry region. In fact, there were only a few thousand European settlers living there in what is present-day Texas. Many of these settlers lived around Jesuit missions. A mission was a missionary compound where Jesuit priests would live in safety behind walls while they would minister or preach to the neighboring villages. So these missions were often located close to Native American communities so that the Jesuits could go and teach their religion to these Native American communities and then go and sleep behind these walls. And so these missions proved excellent forts and foundations of small settlements. Now, let's jump forward again. That was mid-1600s when Mexico was a colony of Spain. When Mexico declared its independence from Spain, not long after American independence was declared, Mexico encouraged trade between the United States and their northern provinces, what is today the state of Texas. They wanted Americans to travel down on the Santa Fe trade route. They wanted Americans to even come and live in these northern provinces for several reasons. Number one, this land was sparsely populated. Texas is a dry region with not many people living in it at this time. And so they wanted it to be settled. But also Native American groups would sometimes attack caravans traveling between Mexico and the United States. And so they wanted people living there to provide safe passage for business people. Now, to protect Mexico's territory, they encouraged American farmers to go to Texas. The Mexican government would offer land grants to agents. They used the word impresario. These agents would take the land granted to them. It would be their responsibility to sell this land cheaply to American settlers. There was a condition to this arrangement. Mexico was inviting American settlers to come live in Texas for almost nothing. They could largely live their lives in freedom. Yet, they were expected to become Mexican citizens. So, Anglo settlers could go live in Texas. In fact, they were coming by the thousands, and they were expected to become Mexican citizens. That meant they were to obey Mexican laws. And we're going to come back to that in just a moment. Now, one of the most successful impresarios, or agents, was a man named Stephen Austin. He established a colony in Texas. This would be an American, Anglo colony of white people living in a Mexican province. Essentially, it would be a town in Mexico. And Stephen Austin would be the mayor of this town. He set up very strict rules. There was to be no drunkenness, no swearing, no gambling, and generally there was a law against mischief. So he was very strict. He ran a very tight ship, but he was very successful, and many people came to his colony to live. Now, the United States government desired more territory. In fact, the United States wanted lands to the south of the Rio Grande, which is currently the border of Texas to the south. The United States offered to buy the territory of Texas from Mexico. And Mexico said, no, we don't want to sell you this land. Now we're going to see what happens when somebody tells the American government, no, you can't have our land. We saw what happened when the Miami Confederacy said no. We saw what happened when Tecumseh and the Shawnee said no. We saw what happened when the Cherokee said no. We saw what happened when the Blackhawks said no. If the United States is denied the right to expand and take, then we will steal and kill. At least that's what history has shown. Meanwhile, one of the biggest problems here is that these Anglos, when I'm using the word Anglo, it means Anglo-Saxon. When these white people were coming into Texas, there were some cultural differences. For one, Anglos speak English, not Spanish. And that's a cultural difference. That can work itself out in a few generations. Eventually, Anglos do learn Spanish, and Spanish people and Americans living in Texas learn to coexist. Many Texans also speak bits of Spanish just because of the proximity they live near Hispanic Americans. But perhaps the biggest difference, and really where Anglos ran into problems with the Mexican government, was slavery. Mexico abolished slavery when they created their country. Yet Southerners were bringing slaves into Texas. Many of these colonies, like the one that Stephen Austin founded, were allowing slavery within their colonies. Many of these impresarios, while arresting drunkards and punishing people for swearing, were tolerating slavery. Now, by the 1830s, there were more Anglos than Tijanos living in Texas. So there were more ethnic whites than ethnic Spanish or mixed Spanish and Native American, what we call mestizos. So more Anglos than Tijanos. Mexico, so Tejanos were outnumbered by Anglos. So I love the irony here. Mexico has an immigration problem. Them white people coming over that line. And they don't want to follow Mexico's laws, and they don't want to learn Spanish. And now the Mexican government is very upset. Again, the language barrier is something that naturally works itself out with immigration within a couple of generations. But the issue of slavery is yet again going to cause trouble. Now, the president of Mexico, Antonio Lopez de Santa Anna, put Stephen Austin in prison because he refused to enforce Mexico's abolition of slavery within his colony. And so they threw the impresario in prison. So Santa Anna revoked the local powers of these land agents, attempted to rule these colonies directly, and this led to rebellions and what would eventually become the Texas Revolution. And so Santa Anna marched into Texas to restore order. So we call this the Texas Revolution. And we think of the Alamo as a heroic fight to the death. But I want to tell the same story with different words. In 1828, John C. Calhoun in South Carolina threatened to nullify the Tariff of 1828. Andrew Jackson threatened to hang John C. Calhoun and threatened to invade South Carolina if they refused to obey federal law. In 1796, Pennsylvania farmers refused to pay their taxes and began to tar and feather tax collectors. George Washington rallied an army of 10,000 militiamen and put down that rebellion. We call those stories of heroism. Now I want to tell the story using different words. Stephen Austin refused to enforce a federal law. He attempted to nullify Mexico's abolition of slavery within his colony. Santa Anna put him in prison and used force, what Jackson had threatened to do, used force to go into these Texas colonies to restore order. Stephen Austin declared a general uprising, and this became known as the Texas Revolution. The first battle of this war was the Alamo. Santa Anna, with 6,000 Mexican soldiers, stormed the Alamo, one of these old missions, where Texas revolutionaries had holed up. There were only 187 Texan defenders, and they died defending the Alamo. And so remember, the Alamo became a rallying cry in this battle. So you just witnessed the old Davy Crockett movie made by Walt Disney back in the 1950s. Every young boy in the 1950s wanted a coonskin cap and a rifle or a BB gun if they were too young, because they wanted to be just like Davy Crockett, congressman from Tennessee. Yep, from my old neck of the woods. Now, Davy Crockett was a very good self-promoter. He had a great publicist. Half of the stories about him were entirely made up by his novelist and his agent. But whatever. Again, made for a good Disney movie. Now, to your left is the Bowie knife. True story, invented by Jim Bowie, who died in the Alamo. Not sure if it was quite like that, but whatever. And these were the subjects of comic books and movies and popular art even of that time. And the story of the Alamo and the story of the Texas Revolution was spun as an act of heroism. But again, I'd like to tell you the story from a different angle. In 2004, Iraq erupted in an insurrection. My roommate was stationed there at the time in the Marines. He was conducting patrols, search and destroys, interrogating suspects of this insurrection. And it was his job to keep the peace in what really was, at that time, an American colony that was in arms against the United States. The media spun that as an insurrection against a lawful government. And the people were branded as bad guys. While my roommate, again, feared for his own life and was shot at and was forced to do things that I'm sure he still has nightmares about. Yet, let's tell the story with different words, from a different side. Texas erupts in insurrection. And Jed Clampett plays the leader of the band. And Davy Crockett is a great hero of this war, even though we really don't know exactly what happened to him. But he was king of the wild frontier. Again, it's how you look at an event that details how you judge that event. That's why we do document analyzers. That's why we do essays. Because it is important that you look at two sides of an issue before you make any kind of decision. So again, that's why we do it. Okay, a little about Sam Houston. He was one of the leaders in this revolution. He was born in 1793, grew up in Tennessee. Everybody famous seems to be from Tennessee for some reason. Well, anyway, he ran away from home, spent a good chunk of his life living among the Cherokee, adopted their way of life, including much of their tactics that we'll see in just a moment. Sam Houston, as the leader of this rebellion, eventually defeated Santa Anna's army at the Battle of San Jacinto. At the Battle of San Jacinto, the Texas revolutionaries defeated Santa Anna's army. If you're into military tactics, it was an interesting game of hit and run and guerrilla maneuvers, ambushes, surprise attacks, etc. A series of battles, but it did conclude with San Jacinto. Now, eventually, Mexico decided that fighting these revolutionaries in Texas wasn't worth it, much like the American Revolution. And so they granted Texans their independence in April of 1836. And so Sam Houston became the president of the new independent Republic of Texas. And so for about 2 years, Texas was a country, all its own thing, for 2 years. And that's why it's called the Lone Star State, because it was a country before it was a state. And it's a really big state as well. Now, Texas invited America to annex, meaning to incorporate Texas into the Union. And so we eventually would, though there was debate about should Texas be allowed to own slaves. But now, let's be honest. Texas wasn't about to become an American state if it meant they had to outlaw slavery, because slavery was what brought Texas into the Revolution after all. And so Texas became a slave state and would fight in the rebellion that we now call the American Civil War much later.
With removal now.
Today we'll be talking about Chapter 9, Section 4, and it's titled The War with Mexico. Now, as the United States annexed Texas, this was obviously upsetting to the Mexican government because the United States had offered to purchase Texas. Mexico had clearly said no. Texas rebelled and seceded from their lawful government in the Texas Revolution, and then the United States offered to annex them. Texas seceded from Mexico because Mexico tried to abolish slavery in this colony that they had invited Americans to move to on the condition that they become lawful Mexican citizens. And so when these Anglos rebelled against their government because of slavery and requested to join the United States as a slave state, when that was confirmed, that was very upsetting. In fact, that was a step towards war with Mexico. President James K. Polk, by the way, Polk County is named after this man, ran for president in 1846 with a campaign slogan, 5640 or fight. Those are lines of longitude and latitude. They refer specifically to the Oregon Territory. His campaign slogan was threatening to go to war with Great Britain if they did not give us territory. And he won and became President of the United States on a threat of war for conquest. You see, conquest, or conquering land, was not considered an evil thing at this time. And while we talk about the war with Mexico, I will bring in some of the moral and ethical problems that come with conquering land. But it was not generally considered a bad thing, not until the two world wars. Really, the two world wars taught us as a global society that conquest can lead to very terrible consequences. But at this time, let me quote a Prussian general: war is but another means of diplomacy. The real contentious political issue in our country was not conquest, not how should we treat conquered peoples, not is this the right thing to do. The real contentious issue was slavery. So James K. Polk, of course, once he was elected, favored war with Mexico. We had offered to buy Texas. They had said no. So we acquired Texas by violent means. Though it was not the United States that fought Mexico in the Texas Revolution, we were the beneficiaries. And so Polk believed that war with Mexico would gain us not only Texas, but also New Mexico and California and the southwestern United States. We could conquer Mexico and we could steal half of their country. And we believed we could get away with it. Now, meanwhile, this was Polk's strategy of how to provoke war with Mexico. He sent John Slidell, his Secretary of State, whose job it is to negotiate treaties, down to Mexico to offer to buy New Mexico. So we've seen this before, right? Because just previously we had offered to buy Texas. They had said no. Now we're offering to buy New Mexico and then negotiate the border with Texas and possibly even buy California. Can you imagine? What if Canada came to us today and said, we'd like to buy Maine, we'd like to buy Oregon, and we'd like to buy Vermont?
Good luck.
Vermont has considered seceding from the United States. Time to time it does come up. They don't feel very connected to us. Politically they identify somewhat differently, more closely with Canada. So what if Canada came and said, by the way, Vermont's been discussing joining with Canada. We'd like to go ahead and make that formal. And the United States obviously is going to say, no way, Jose. Well, then what if Canada said, by the way, this is happening, whether you want it to or not. Vermont actually kind of wants to be a part of Canada. So this is happening. And what are you going to do about it? Well, we're obviously going to do something about it. You don't just take Vermont. Just like Mexico said the same thing. The United States came down to Mexico and said, we're taking Texas. And Mexico says, no way, Jose. And we say, by the way, a number of people in Texas want to be a part of the United States. Mexico is still going to be upset. It's their territory. And so, of course, Slidell was rejected. But that was the first part of the strategy. You have to try diplomacy, otherwise you appear like a bad guy. Now, Santa Anna was disgraced. By the way, Santa Anna was the president of Mexico during the Texas Revolution. He was disgraced because of Texas's victory, and he was ousted. In fact, after the Texas Revolution, the Mexican government was becoming increasingly unstable. So meanwhile, since Slidell had been rejected, Polk sent General Zachary Taylor with the United States Armed Forces to blockade the Rio Grande, the major trading route in the Gulf of Mexico around the southern border of Texas. So he essentially sent a large army to stand right on the border of Mexico, to just stand there and to blockade the Rio Grande, the major trading port in that area. Abraham Lincoln, meanwhile, was beginning to question Polk's motives, and we'll come back to that in just a moment. Now, Abraham Lincoln was a senator at this time. So he wasn't president of the United States. He didn't have executive authority. He was involved in passing laws in our country, and of course it is Congress that has the right to declare war. A president may send troops to a place like he did with Zachary Taylor for a time, but a formal declaration of war does come from Congress. This army, sent to blockade the Rio Grande, was meant to provoke a fight. And sure enough, a fight did break out. In fact, if you think of this as United States border and this as Mexico, there's a little town right on the border called Matamoros. Anybody ever heard of it? Okay, that was the site of the first bloodshed in the U.S. war with Mexico. Now, Matamoros is south of the border. It's in Mexico. Very clearly, look at a map. It's not debatable. There was a bar in Matamoros, and these soldiers would frequently go to that bar. That's what soldiers do. They go to bars. And what else do soldiers do in bars? Well, sometimes they get in fights. Sometimes these fights get nasty, especially if the bar would be in, quote, enemy territory. In this particular bar fight, 9 American soldiers got themselves killed. 9 American soldiers got themselves killed in a bar fight in Mexico. If you know anything about border towns, that's, sadly today these aren't the safest places in the world. But this led President Polk to go in front of Congress to pound his fist on the table, pound his fist on the podium, and shout, "American blood on American soil." And what do you think Congress did when he stood up and he shouted, "American blood on American soil"?
Asked, was it really?
Well, Lincoln asked, was it really? But I think he was the only one. His voice was drowned out.
I guess they all screamed for war.
Because let me give you a few other examples. So Polk shouted, "American blood and American soil, let's go to war." Can you think of any other times where that has happened?
Revolution.
Remember the Maine, 1888. USS Maine exploded in Havana Harbor in Cuba. December 7th, 1941, a day that will forever live in infamy. What was that one? Pearl Harbor, good. This day, September 11th, 2001, terrorists have hijacked airliners, crashing them into the World Trade Center, the Pentagon, and one has crashed over Pennsylvania soil. What was that one? 9/11. And then finally, on this day, in 1964, in the Gulf of Tonkin, North Vietnamese have torpedoed an American patrol boat, killing American soldiers aboard an American ship. Anybody know that one? That was the start of the Vietnam War. Now, in all of those cases I just cited, we had soldiers stationed near or on the soil of the enemy that fired at us. In every one of those cases, we had troops in Saudi Arabia prior to 9/11. We had troops in Matamoros prior to the U.S. war with Mexico. We had troops in the Gulf of Tonkin, which, by the way, if you look at a map, is on North Vietnam's Gulf. We had troops in Havana Harbor in Cuba, which, by the way, was Spanish territory at that time. In all of those cases, the people that we wound up fighting claimed that we were provoking a conflict by stationing troops north of the border. Now, again, there's two sides to the story, right? We argued, our counter-argument with Saudi Arabia, which I'll get to much later, was that these troops were there to maintain peace. Our counter-argument here was that we were to blockade the Rio Grande in response to our rejection of an offer for purchase. Our response in 1964, to keep peace. Our response in 1898, to keep peace. I could go on with almost every example of every conflict that we have been involved with in some way. Because the reason we do these essays, ladies and gentlemen, is there are many sides to a story. In fact, your U.S. war with Mexico, this very question that I'm discussing with you at great length, will be your question for the next essay. Was the U.S. war with Mexico justified? When Polk pounded his fist on the table, was he telling the truth, or was Lincoln telling the truth? You see, Representative Abraham Lincoln was perhaps the only voice here that actually questioned the legitimacy of Polk's statement. He had to be the thorn in the side and ask, can you tell me where this fight actually occurred? Was it on American soil, like you said? Because have you looked at a map of Matamoros? Well, Congress didn't look at the map either, and so the fight happened. Meanwhile, how did Americans feel about this? You see, most Americans weren't going, where's Matamoros exactly? No one really cared. I hate to say it. No one was really wondering about the ethics of provoking a war for conquest. This was commonplace. That's how Germany began, by the way. Otto von Bismarck provoked a war with France to gain territory that gave the Germans a common enemy, unifying them as a state. That was occurring around the same time as the U.S. war with Mexico. Meanwhile, the only real matter for debate in this war is whether we should allow slavery in the new territories that we conquer. I hate to say it, that was about it. No one was really scratching their heads and going, should we conquer this land? Everyone was fine with that. In fact, here is the land that we conquered from Mexico in this war. That is roughly the size of half of their country, ladies and gentlemen. In fact, if you've ever wondered why Mexico has many of the political and economic problems that they have, why many people have left Mexico to come to the United States, much of it can be traced back to this war. Generally, stealing half of a country doesn't work out well for what's left of it. I mean, think of Germany after the Second World War, where the Soviet Union conquered East Germany. Think of so many places that have been conquered and territory has been stolen. It doesn't typically turn out well. Okay, so I've already told you the story of how Polk provoked the war and the conflict in Matamoros that resulted in 9 American deaths. Congress resoundingly approved the war. Like most debates, I don't know if you watched the recent one, people aren't always watching to see who is right. Sometimes people are just watching to see who sounds the best or who is the loudest. Even though Lincoln was right, his voice was drowned out by the rest of Congress. They were all fired up about this. They were already writing country songs. And so, President Polk, Commander-in-Chief of the United States Army, ordered Colonel Stephen Kearny to march down to Santa Fe. Same Santa Fe that we had been conducting with business for decades. New Mexico surrendered to the United States without a fight. And so here we see a wood engraving of Colonel Stephen Kearny capturing Santa Fe, New Mexico. You don't see any fighting in this picture because it was actually resolved peacefully. Many of the people that were ruling New Mexico at that time were white Americans that had moved down there to trade. It's not unlike the story in Hawaii. In fact, in Hawaii, by the way, we conquered the islands of Hawaii in the late 1800s because there were a number of American sugar planters that wanted to take over the islands. And so with the help of the U.S. Marines, we conquered Hawaii, and now it is a state of the Union. Same with New Mexico. And then we get to California. Remember, this is a war of conquest. And so Stephen Kearny and the U.S. Army were sent into these areas to conquer them in the name of the United States. Now, in the 1830s, there were roughly 12,000 Mexican settlers in California. By 1840, there were only 500 Americans. Now I want to tell you a different story. In 1938, Hitler claimed that there were ethnic Germans living in Czechoslovakia, and that these ethnic Germans were being abused by the ethnic Czechs living there and the Slovaks living there, and that these Germans needed freedom. They needed to be with Germany. And so he used that as his justification in the Munich Conference, which will be a later essay in US 2, to invade Czechoslovakia. Now, I want to tell you the same story using different words. In 1840, there were 500 white people living in California. These 500 white people needed freedom from those 12,000 Mexican settlers that were living there. And so General Stephen Kearny and President James K. Polk used that as justification to invade California. And so with the help of General John C. Fremont, the Republic of California was created in 1846. Fremont joined with Stephen Kearny and Commodore John D. Sloat of the U.S. Navy to declare California an American territory. Now, in the war with Mexico, in fact, we were not only interested in the Southwest, we sent an invading force to capture and occupy Mexico City. Can you imagine? Mexico City is the second largest city on the planet. And so we sent an army to conquer Mexico City. And within 6 months, we had arrived. The United States was generally the victor in this war. Mexico suffered from poor leadership in their military, from an instability in their government. And the invasion of Mexico, led by General Zachary Taylor and Winfield Scott, again captured Mexico City within 6 months. Polk promised to help Santa Anna return to power if Santa Anna promised to surrender to the United States, and so Polk helped Santa Anna get back into power, but Santa Anna continued the fight with the United States for a short time. But in the end, the two parties reached an agreement for a conditional truce, and the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo was signed. Now, this treaty was signed in 1848. The provisions of this treaty set that Texas would have its southern border at the Rio Grande. Mexico would sell these lands to the United States for $15 million. And Mexicans living in these territories would have the same rights as any other American citizen. So if you've ever wondered why so many people speak Spanish in the southwestern region of our country, it's because many of their ancestors were there prior to 1848. Meaning they're not immigrants that have moved over. They were naturalized American citizens because their land was conquered by the United States. And so culturally, much of the Southwest still identifies as Hispanic. So the war enlarged American territory roughly by 1/3. The final acquisition was authorized in 1853. It was known as the Gadsden Purchase. Now, meanwhile, the election in 1848, Again, I want to point out a distinction here. The 2004 presidential election was all about the Iraq War. Should we continue this war? And that was from the very beginning, by the way. Or should we elect someone who will end this war? Now, in 1848, right after the war with Mexico, again, you have to understand the difference in the culture. No one was debating, should we have done this? Everyone was debating, should we allow slavery in these new territories? Now, the Democrats were divided. Southern Democrats certainly wanted slavery to extend into the territories. Northern Democrats not so much. And this allowed for the Whig nominee, Zachary Taylor, to win the election of 1848. There was no Republican Party at this time. There were Whigs and there were Democrats. And that was it. So there's the Gadsden Purchase, by the way. It's the final acquisition of the southern border. And finally, in 1848, gold was discovered in California. Now, I mentioned during the war, there were only 500 white people living in California. Most had come there to set up a naval port, to trade with Asian countries. But when gold was discovered in them there hills in 1848, people rushed to California. Blows my mind. Within a year, enough people had moved to California for discussion of statehood to begin. Guys, that's 500,000 people. So within a year, 500,000 people had moved. No, excuse me, that's not accurate. I think 200 to 250,000 people had moved within a year. And that's called the gold rush. People moving to California for gold were calling themselves 49ers because much of these people were going over in 1849, coming from all over the world for the hope of getting rich quick.
Just days before the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo was signed, gold was discovered at Sutter's Mill, and soon the California gold rush was on. By 1850, California had become populated enough to become the 31st state. 8 years after gold was found in California, it was discovered in Colorado. Within months, 100,000 people had come. Enough of them stayed to make Colorado a U.S. territory in 1861. The third gold rush was in the Klondike region of Canada, where gold was found in 1897. This brought thousands of people to the Klondike region, and many also went further west to Alaska in search of gold. Miners also played a part in the growth of Virginia City, Nevada, and in opening up South Dakota's Black Hills to settlement.
So the impact of this gold fever. San Francisco became a supply center for miners. Many of them were going into the Sierras in the northern part of the state, but they would pass through Southern California on their way and pick up supplies. And so San Francisco became an important commercial hub from the very beginning of California's statehood. Now, when California's population exceeded 100,000, that was the number I was looking for, 100,000, they applied for statehood. I mean, can you believe that? Within a year, that many people traveled all the way across the country. This is prior to the Transcontinental Railroad. That means they either walked or they took horses or they rode those bumpy wagons all the way, 3,000 miles, by the way. Even today, in an automobile, that's about a 48-hour drive, 2 days solid drive.
How long again?
Roughly 3,000 miles. Yep. Now, slavery was permitted in California until it was outlawed. Eventually, California will join the Union as a free state, and they will actually send some soldiers to fight in the Civil War, even considering their great distance from the southeast. But we'll talk more about California's transition towards statehood I did want to show you a brief cartoon here about people rushing to California. There was no such thing as a flying car at that time, obviously, but the point of the cartoon is that people were going by any means necessary. This guy was willing to swim to catch a boat. They wanted to go. You see, they all have pickaxes because they want to get rich finding gold.